Welcome to the NAC Ask Me Anything. My name's Flifford Schexnayder. I'm an NAC member and the eminent scholar emeritus from Arizona State University. The National Academy of Construction was established to recognize industry leaders. An important purpose of the Academy is to provide a network and system of linkage for construction industry. As such, we established this Ask Me Anything to help transfer knowledge to our next generation of construction leaders. Hank Harris is the chairman of FMI Corporation. FMI provides strategic advice to firms in the engineering and construction industry. He earned a bachelor's degree. Excuse me a minute. There we go. From the University of Richmond and an MBA from Virginia Commonwealth University. Hank is responsible for the management and governance of FMI Board of Directors. He consults on matters of organization, strategic planning, and execution of strategic plans through mergers and acquisitions. His background with regional building, real estate, and development organizations provides him with a practical approach, while his extensive activities in management education and consulting provide him with an objective viewpoint. He is widely sought as a speaker on industry topics. He has published 3 books on strategic planning and creating long-term value within the industry. He is a certified management consultant and a member of the American Arbitration Association and the Consulting Contractors Council of America. He serves on the board of directors and advisory boards of several major construction companies. Before he gets started, I want to ask you to send in questions, please. Our speakers will make a short presentation on their careers. That's going to come next. One student will pick to win a $500 scholarship, so those questions could earn you a little help going through school. I know it's pretty expensive today. So now I'm going to let Hank tell you a little bit about himself and FMI Corporation.
Well, thank you, Cliff. It's nice to be with you all, and I appreciate you having me. I might be a little bit of an unusual speaker, and I think many of you are training and studying and preparing for positions, or maybe already in positions that are doing engineering or doing construction, or actually being in industry production oriented. My firm was really a management consulting firm originally, and then we ended up in investment banking, but we're not really contractors or engineers. We are people that provide service to contractors and engineers. And so what we did, and you can see some of this on the slides, but we provided an array of management consulting type of services to, generally speaking, what I would call mid-sized firms and up. And then ultimately wound up in the merger and acquisition business, which is basically the lion's share of our investment banking work. So we're really advisors, consultants, I think, in terms of culturally who we were and we're all about. I should say I'm probably a little bit on the tail end of my FMI years. I spent 35 years of career with that firm. I still have an affiliation there, and I still dabble a little bit, but I'm probably not as busy with them as I historically have been. I was the firm's CEO for 12 years and then became chairman. I still carry that title, but I'm sort of backing out a lot of the day-to-day. And there's only really one reason for that. I loved every minute of it. It was a great career, but I lived on an airplane for 35 years, and I just kind of got to the point where enough was enough. Many of you will find yourself probably traveling some, but we traveled a lot, and it was a very intense part of that particular business. So, in any event, that's kind of where I came from, and I've been at it a long time, and I'd like to help you all in whatever way I can.
Okay, this is Cliff again. I've got some questions that have come in here, and I'm gonna put them to Hank. First one, Grace Stekwowski at Manhattan College. And she would like to know, where did you begin your background in real estate, and how does that help you with your current consulting?
That's a good question. The background in real estate for me was, I would say, was relatively light. But I did have real estate broker's licenses and did dabble a little bit in that. And frankly, I did most of it when I was pretty young. I was in my 20s when I did most of that. I kind of accidentally had a couple of real estate development clients. A lot of building contractors will get into real estate, and so we ended up doing some consulting for those people that did. But I don't consider myself a real estate expert by any stretch of the imagination. You know, I was sort of peripherally involved with it. I think probably one thing I would say about real estate is that, you know, it's in the value chain of construction for obvious reasons. And so if you understand a lot of things that drive real estate activity, by sort of default, you will understand some things that will ultimately drive construction market activity.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yes, they are. I know a few construction companies that have got in the real estate business. Okay, I've got a question here from Purdue. I'm prejudiced. I got a degree from Purdue. Aside from your own books, what are 2 books you recommend for college students?
I think the answer to that probably depends on what you're interested in, and obviously there are a whole lot of books out there, and I can only speak to the kinds of books that I've read. I should say I love to read. I've always been a voracious reader, and in my younger days, some of this was the era that I came along in. There was kind of a, you know, the concept of the management book, since we were management consultants, appealed to me. And there really weren't a lot of those written till about 1980. And then they took off like a rocket ship. And if you look at it today, there's a wide array of product out there about, you know, business and management and all that stuff. And if you were to go into my library in my home, you'd see all kinds of it. But, you know, after probably 25 years of reading that stuff, I kind of got to the conclusion that it was either fiction or I'd had enough of it. And one of the things I personally like to read, and I get more out of than just about anything, and I think young people, it's the same thing. I like to read biographies of famous, successful people. I learn more from that than anything, and you can pick who they might be. But, you know, the book on Steve Jobs I thought was outstanding. Somebody wrote a book on Warren Buffett called Snowball. One of the best things I ever read. So I just think that's a good direction for reading if you're inclined that way.
I would second that. Okay. Victor at the University of Kentucky wants to know, what has been the best ways that you have found to network with people and gain valuable connections?
Well, I tell you, I got pretty fortunate in several ways. One of which was I met a fellow who was one of the best networkers that I've ever met in my life. He came out of the insurance industry, and he's since deceased. But he was very involved with the Beavers, which is a West Coast heavy civil organization. Guy's name was John Lamberson, and John kind of indirectly taught me a lesson that one of the best ways to network with people is you remember about them, or if you can't remember, you learn about them and do your best to remember, write it down if you have to, and do that with everybody that you can think of. Keep a personal database of people, and above everything else, go out of your way to help people. If you think about life being a long proposition, things come back around to you. And if you just be good to people and help people, you know, it may not pay like this week, but you'd be surprised 10 years from now, you'll get a phone call and somebody will help you back. And if you build your goodwill that way with people, you help other people network, help other people get to know people. That'll be all the networking you need to do.
Yeah. John Lamberson was, I'd call him my mentor. You're right. Everything Hank just said, I would second that, and Lamberson just taught me those same things.
He was the master of it.
Oh God, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's like always helping people, always. Okay, I got another question from the University of Kentucky. Lucas wants to know, what is your opinion about getting an MBA in addition to your engineering degree?
I would have a very positive opinion of that. You know, it's interesting. I think times have changed, and the value assigned to degrees probably not quite the same as when I came along. But I've always been a big believer in education. I think education has a sometimes an intangible return on investment. A lot of people look for the absolute return on investment, but it's really hard to quantify what knowledge and education can do for you over the span of your life. So if you can swing it, I would be very much inclined to endorse an MBA, especially on top of an engineering degree, because most of the people that I went to MBA school with were engineers. They were so smart they could sleep through all the MBA math, and you know, meanwhile I had to sit in the front of the class and struggle. So I think it's a great combination of background. I couldn't, in fact, I'd have a hard time thinking of a better combination. But that's my personal bias too.
Like I said, I went to Purdue. They made engineers go over to the Cranner Business School and take courses. Just you said it. You said it. You're right. I've got another one here from Sonny. While in school, how important is it to have some practical experience of the construction industry before we finally start working full-time after graduation?
I would say that it's definitely helpful, just like anything else in life. If you know a little something about it before you start working in a full-time capacity, it's going to help you. It's going to help you with the language. It's going to help you with some understanding where some people are coming from, lay of the land kind of thing. At the same time, I wouldn't discourage anybody that didn't know anything about it, because I think, you know, it can all be learned. And I always like to say that what you do out of school, it's kind of like an elevator in a giant skyscraper. You know, school might let you out on the second floor, it might let you out on the third floor, but no school is going to let you out on the 100th floor. The rest of it's a climb. So I think it's helpful. I don't think it's mandatory.
Okay. I've got a question here from Raj. Being the largest provider of management consultancy, you may be dealing with clients in all segments of the industry. Can you discuss the importance of record keeping and the steps to resolve disputes before they become claims?
Yeah, I'd certainly be glad to take a stab at it. I don't know that I'm a claims expert either, but I can tell you that in certain forms of contracting, you know, all forms of contracting are going to lend themselves to some of it, some forms more than others. But the bottom line is, if you think there's a risk of dispute, and generally speaking, there's always some risk of it, you know, really you would be foolish not to pay close attention to record keeping. I'll give you an extreme example, and the extreme example might help. But there's a well-known contractor out there, very famous, very large. And one of the things they're well known for is that when they break ground on a project, they've got the smartest lawyer that they can find, and the smartest engineer that they can find. And they're building a claim parallel to building the job, even before they need it. And they may never need it. But the fact is, if the public entity that they typically work for decides to randomly start giving them a hard time, they can pull a file out of a drawer that, if you printed it out, is already probably a foot thick. And I'm not suggesting that's the only way to do business, but I am suggesting that if you don't have the records, if you don't have the documentation, you'll never perfect a claim. It can be very costly.
Claims are costly. There's no way around it.
Absolutely.
All right. I got Michael asking, in your experience, what is the key to developing a good team?
That's a really good question. the there's a definition of teams that I'm going to see if I can pull this off the top of my aging head here, but they speak of, I think it's 4 or 5 things, and one of them is what they call norms, and norms basically is shared values. What are the things that we as a group who aspires to be a team, we all value similar things. And in companies, they talk about their core values and those kinds of things. And I personally think those are very important to instill in an organization or even a small team. Along with that is, you hear the word culture. Culture is really an extension of the value system. It's what do we think our shared behaviors are? And then a team can't function well if everybody doesn't know what their team assignment is. So, you don't go on a basketball court and decide that, I don't know if I'm going to be point guard or not, or you could pick your sports metaphor, but everybody on the team needs to know their role. And everybody on the team also needs to know what is the structure of the team. And I think if you address those things with your team, you'll have a good chance of putting a solid foundation under them.
Very important. All of those things are very important. All right. Sattler Bennett, what is it like to work on several different boards of directors at the same time?
That's a great question. And I would say the short answer is it's one of the greatest pleasures of my life, particularly right now. I really enjoy working on boards. A couple of the company boards that I'm on, probably actually, I think about it, at least 3 or 4 of them, I probably have known the people for 20 or 25 years. And so it's very close relationships, and it's an honor. I mean, it's just an honor to be on these boards. And it's, it's great, especially at my age, to be able to look back and draw on, your war stories and just help the next generation of leaders and managers, as they're trying to push the envelope with their businesses and make their businesses, productive and all that. It's a great thing to do. I just couldn't say more good things about it.
Hank, when you and I were talking, you told me a couple of boards. We don't need to talk about the companies, but I thought those companies had their culture. And in your previous question, you were talking about culture. And I think it's very important in those countries. Maybe you could talk to that a little more.
Yeah. And I'd say that culture is a very strong element in all the companies that that I tend to serve on their boards. But I see it in plenty of other really great companies. I will say one thing that's interesting about construction, construction, and maybe engineering and other forms of things associated with the industry to a lesser extent. But if you take pure construction, it's very risky. It's a tough business in terms of making the risk reward ratio work itself out. And it's not a business for, in my mind, it's not a business for the faint of heart. You have to be, when you're in construction, you have to get up every day excited about the world and ready to go, tackle Mount Everest, so to speak. It's a demanding business, but a joyful one at the same time. And I think the successful companies use their cultures, and I think they do it sometimes even though they may not say it this way. Their cultures are really part of their control system. Projects will be if a project gets out of control, that's going to put a dent in a company. If 2 projects get out of control, it's going to put a big dent in the company. And if 3 get out of control, it may put the company under. And, you just can't have that. So a lot of successful construction takes strong control. And a lot of people think strong control comes through CPM schedules and book logs. And I'm not saying it doesn't. But if you don't get control through behavior, through everybody driving through the right behavior, I don't think you'll win. And I think that's what a culture is. It's shared behavior. And so they use that successfully to drive their people to be successful, and which in turn makes the company successful.
I think that's right on target. That's right on target. Okay, I've got another question Looks like Bruce Fryman at Kentucky. What is one piece of advice you would give to someone who has just graduated and looking for their first job?
Well, I'd say if you just graduated and you're looking for your first job, one thing I would say is congratulations on your timing, because I can't imagine a better a better market for you to walk out into. But I would say, one thing I would put out as advice is, people will always say, follow your passion, and you'll hear all these sort of patent answers to that question. But I really look at it a little bit differently. I think the smart thing to do is get out there and get your hands, metaphorically dirty. Get out there and do things. Get out there and just help the company you're with. If it lasts forever, great. If it lasts for just a couple of years, that'll be fine too. But the main thing is, get out there and try things. If you take 100 people who were in their early 20s and lined them up and said, how many of you are absolutely sure you want to do this one thing for your entire career? I don't think you'd find one or two people who could step forward with that. The other 98 are going to experiment. So don't be afraid of experimenting. Don't be afraid of following your intuition. I wound up in my firm and in the profession of consulting largely on an intuitive basis, and maybe somewhat of an accidentally intuitive basis. But you just don't worry about perfection, and don't let perfection be the enemy of good.
I think you're right on target. I liked your part there about get your boots in the mud. One of the first jobs, I was a field engineer, and I'd stay late in the evening and work with the mechanics to learn about the equipment and everything. Get out there and get dirty. You're right. Okay, I've got a question from Ali out at Cal State. My professor said in class that FMI has done research about how many times materials get moved and relocated. Please explain a little bit about it and demonstrate how important it is for a project.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm not exactly an expert in that area, but I can tell you I've heard some of the same things over the years. And really that all goes under the umbrella of something called field productivity. And there are all kinds of improvement programs out there these days. Lean construction is one of the better known programs, but it all comes down to how do you work in an intelligent way at the crew level and actually think about what makes work efficient and effective. And a lot of people think, the idea is, well, we're just trying to get everybody to work harder, but it's really not about that. It's really about just basic smart decisions. And what happens with a lot of construction sites is that the planning is, maybe for lack of planning, or maybe for lack of planning that gets done by the immediate supervisor, materials, to go back to your specific, materials are put 100 yards away from where they should be, or even could be, to make things work efficiently. Well, if you've got a crew of 15 people and all 15 people have to walk an extra 100 yards and they have to do that both directions and they have to do it for the next year, how much lost time did you just rack up that otherwise could have been saved? And that's really what that whole thing is all about.
Yep. I think you're right on there too. University of Wisconsin, Madeline, what specific challenges have you faced working in this industry?
That's a great question. My answer will probably be a little bit unusual because I worked in the industry from the standpoint of more of being an advisor to the businesses. And so I see the challenges more from a business perspective than I do necessarily an operational point of view. And I can only tell you what my own view is. So I would say that there are two things in the construction industry that I've found challenging. I've also found them interesting. So I don't mean to say that they're necessarily bad, but challenging and interesting sometimes can coexist. And one of those things for me has been that most of these businesses are privately held, and many of them are owned by families. In fact, if you looked at family ownership throughout the construction industry, you would see an awful lot of it. And so I've spent a lot of my career trying to help family firms make sure that they don't forget that they're in business and that they can function with the business health first and the family dynamics trailing in the background. And that's sometimes easier said than done. But for me, that's been kind of an interesting challenge. And I think the other thing, and maybe somewhat hand in glove with that, but contractors particularly are very entrepreneurial. And I mean, and that's a wonderful thing in many respects, but their entrepreneurial nature can also cause them to be sometimes lacking in focus. And that lack of focus can get in their way as they start to build a mature organization. So you'll see when you get into businesses, there's something called the old life cycle curve, where you go from inception to startup to growth to maturity. And a lot of company founders are really great at the entrepreneurial phases of the business. Once the business gets mature, they're less maybe prone to knowing exactly how to steward that along. And that can be challenging.
Yeah, yeah. They grow and they need to change. All right, I've got a question. Christina, I was wondering who you receive the most pressure from on a construction projects. And I guess we'd have to answer that in a general way, but I'll let you take it.
Well, I will say this, let's think about pressure for just a second. Let's say your boss is yelling at you, or let's say your teammates are unhappy, or, pick a scenario, but ultimately, where does the pressure come from? I feel like ultimately the pressure comes one way or the other from whoever the contract is with. And, the owner sets the stage, and if the owner is going to be difficult and hard to deal with and unreasonable and looks at contractors as a commodity and all of those things that we could all talk about the rest of the week, it's going to be a difficult project. It's going to stress everybody out. And when people are stressed, they're not going to be on their best behavior with each other. So ultimately, I think it emanates from the source of the contract, would be my 2 cents worth. Even though it might seem like it's coming from someplace else sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're right on target. All right. We'll have it out here in the East is saying, in your experience, what is the key to ensuring a company is compliant with the laws, the regulations, and the standards?
That's a great question. There are so many laws, regulations, and standards out there that is literally mind-boggling. I think, it's a sad fact in America in many ways, but the reality is you just got to have legal counsel, and you got to have it every step of the way. If you're a small company, you probably can't afford to have an in-house counsel, but you're going to at least have a close relationship with a construction law firm and somebody that specializes in it, so they know what they're doing and can be also a good strategic advisor on what to do and what not to do relative to risk. And then when you get bigger, you're probably going to want to have an in-house counsel, and the in-house counsel will still probably manage some outside law firms. But bottom line is the regulatory environment is so complicated, it's just mind-boggling. And you just have to have the advisors out there, CPAs, lawyers, consultants of various types. You can't live without. You can't get anything done without them. They're just a necessary part of today's world.
Yeah. Yes, that's all I can say is yes. They got many rules and everything else. All right. Lucas wants to know, what's the difference between being the CEO and chairman of the board? What's the big differences? And what's the difference in leadership and decision making?
That's a very good question. I think, there's some companies obviously that where those roles coexist. I personally am of the camp, there's kind of a debate in public companies these days as to whether the chairmanship should be separated from the CEO role. I personally think it should be. I can't, I think that just the more eyes you have on the situation where they can be objective and they can also be challenging each other, I think that's a healthy thing. I think you get the CEO and the chairman being the same person, it puts too much power in the hands of one individual. And that's a personal editorial view of it. But to answer your question more directly, the CEO runs the business day to day. The CEO sets the direction. He motivates all the managers. He sets the stage for what the company's going to do. He orchestrates the strategic plan. I mean, the CEO runs the business, and the buck stops with the CEO in that regard. The chairman of the board runs the board, and the board's job is to oversee management. And it's almost like a check and balance. It's kind of, if you want to use a government analogy, you have legislative, executive, and judicial, right? Well, in business, you have some similar checks and balances, and board chairmanship is ostensibly one of those. Even if it's the same guy, the reality is a good board of directors is not supposed to be rubber stamping what management says. A good board of directors should be challenging management, should be pushing back on management, should be pointing out things that are not going well, should be asking hard questions. And, that's the role. So the chairman is in charge of that. The CEO is in charge of the business.
Okay. Tyler wants to know traits for the best workers in your company, as well as the companies you've worked for.
Well, that's a great question. I'm going to give you kind of an answer that I took a long time ago, and a lot of people probably heard it by now, but it's, McKinsey, who's the famous giant, sort of corporate America consulting firm. But back in the day, they used to say that they hired people who were swans, and they called them swans. And SWAN was an acronym. And SWAN stood for they're smart, they work hard, they're ambitious, and they're nice. You get those four things, you got something.
They want to know, what would you consider the most important personal attributes for a successful project manager?
That's a very good question. I would say a good project manager, first of all, my hat is off to project managers. I think they have the ultimate where the rubber meets the road job. And, anybody that's good at project management, I'm a fan, because it's a tough job. But to be good at it, I think, you have to be very good at the blocking and tackling stuff. But what I mean by that is, the definition of management is plan, organize, and control, right? So you translate to project management, you got to be good at lining out the project, understanding where the vulnerabilities are. You got to be good at, understanding the schedule and players and all that. One thing that's maybe a key that I believe is often not talked about enough is, you're going to be a great project manager, you've got to understand the financial aspects of that project. And that's the difference between great project managers and people who just sort of muddle through. And, really, if you look at coming up with a cost to complete number on a project, the only way to really get it right is you basically got to almost re-estimate the job. And if you have to do that every month or every quarter, that's a pretty demanding task. So you know, you can say, well, I'm not going to do it. And I think there's a lot of people out there who don't, frankly, or they do a drive-by shooting version of it. But then all that stuff winds up in the company's financial statements. And next thing you know, the company's got financial statements that are basically wrong, which leads to business problems. And all that comes bubbling up from that one simple thing of the financial management of the job. So financial understanding and how it relates to the project, I'd probably almost put that at the top of the list.
I agree. Again, Hank was talking about it from the financial side. I had a project one time in North Carolina, and we weren't doing very well. And every morning I wanted to see on my desk what was the production with the equipment. And it's pretty easy to see where we were wasting money. So you can see it in production because production drives costs. You got to pay attention. Esther wants to know, did you have a mentor growing up? And if so, how did it help you become what you are today?
You know, at the risk of dating myself, I think when I came along, we didn't have people called mentors as much as we had people that were just role models. So I had a lot of role models when I was a kid. And you know, I'm a product of the past. So it just happened that mine were mostly males, and they were mostly professional males. And one of them was a brain surgeon. One of them was a lawyer. Lots of business people. They came from all kinds of different places, but those people that I knew as a kid, you know, kind of gave me the idea of what does it mean to be a professional, and what does it mean to want to be a professional and to engage the world that way. And I guess life sort of went on from there. Once I got in business, one of the guys in my firm, and probably more than one really, and some of the people that were my forebears were just terrific role models. Again, I don't know that I would use the word mentor per se, but you learned by watching them. And I was lucky because they were worthy. They were all worthy of emulation, and I learned that way.
I'd second what he just said. People were role models. We didn't use the term mentor, but they helped us. And when you go out, all of y'all that are listening to this, you've got that same obligation to help the people underneath you. And I would encourage you to do that. I've got a question here. They want to know what delivery methods you think the industry is moving to.
Well, that's a really complicated question because the industry has moved to some delivery methods that I think it's starting to regret moving to.
Yeah, I bet that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you know what I'm talking about. But I think, you know, some of it depends on the type, you know, the sector of the industry also that you're in. I mean, the building sector, you know, if you're building buildings, you know, design build has gone through iterations of popularity. I think it's relatively on the upswing again. And I think, you know, done well and done right, it can be a really terrific thing. There actually really aren't that many companies in the United States that have built that as a consistent business model, despite how much it's talked about. Most design build ends up being sort of, I call it a shotgun marriage between designer and contractor, as opposed to a truly integrated business model. But there are a handful of those out there. And the heavy civil world, you know, the big locks and dams and bridges and airports and, you know, civil construction type stuff. One of the things that's happened is that's all moved to a lot of this gigantic public-private partnership stuff. And it's all put under the umbrella of alternative delivery. But the reality is the devil is in the details very much on all that stuff. And there's some people that have taken big P3 projects, and unfortunately, some of them are friends of mine, and I can tell you they've got maximum regret of doing it right now. So I think the pendulum is actually starting to swing back the other way with a lot of these companies rethinking, do I really want to do alternative delivery? And if I do, what does that really mean? and how big should these jobs get? Because the bigger the jobs are, the bigger the risk. And, you know, there's some companies regretting that aspect of it too. So I could go on and all week, but I think what you see in alternative delivery is like what you see in fashion. It will come and it will go. And it'll move around on you.
I think you're right on target about the P3s. I got some friends with a few bad ones right now. Here's an interesting question. What are the keys to forming a communication structure during a public outreach phase of a project? And a lot of these projects have put it on the contractor to do the public relations. So I think that's a pretty good question.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a very short answer, but it's also a very specific answer. And if I had to confront that myself, I would hire an expert. It's as simple as that. There's some communications consultants out there, crisis management. I know people that do nothing but manage crises for a living. And, you know, life is complicated. You guys, the more you're in it, the more complicated it gets. And specialization is the watchword of the day. If you think you're going to be figuring out everything for yourself, I mean, there's just not enough time. You've got to rely on people that do it for a living. If you get somebody that's a communications consultant, knows how to do that stuff, you think you're going to be having those kinds of projects, I'd put them on retainer if I thought I was going to have a lot of them. Or at least I would hire them on a one-off basis. But you sure don't want to, I don't think you want to try to do it yourself by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot to it, a lot more than people give it credit for.
Yeah, I'm seeing more and more of that, and in most of the cases, the contractors I know, just for exactly what you said, they went out and hired a professional firm to take care of it. How do you help prioritize competing and simultaneous urgent tasks? How do you decide what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, I guess is the way to put it.
I wish I had the answer to that. That's
a tough question.
Tough balance for all of us. It's the urgent versus the important. I'll give you one thought, and I hope it's helpful. But the stuff that's really important, but it's not urgent, but you know it's nagging you in your back of your mind, and you feel like you ought to get to it, or you should put some valuable time into getting to it. I sometimes think what you have to do is say to yourself, I'm going to take my calendar and I'm going to block off this day or this half day or whatever you think makes sense. And you literally just X it out on your calendar and say, this is going to, I'm going to spend this 4-hour block of time. And and if it's complicated enough or hard enough, you probably ought to get out of the office or get someplace where you're not distracted and you can think. Because a lot of the stuff that's really important, but it's not urgent, it requires a lot of thinking. And that's why it's easy to put off. It's always, I do the same thing, even at my age. It's easier to open up your email and respond to a bunch of craziness than it is to think about the hard things. But if you don't set the time for yourself to think about the hard things, the time will just get away from you. And I think, a lot of times things seem overwhelming because they're big and they're complicated, these important issues. And, there's the old thing about take one bite out at a time, break the elephant down into its little pieces. But you can't do that if you don't X the time out and get away somewhere quiet where you can focus on it. So that'd be a thought.
I think you're right on target again. I know in my own career, I've had to just go hide somewhere and do that. No telephone, none of the other stuff. Let's see. What do you do when you kept your promise on a project, even that it might be difficult? I guess what you're trying to say is that you said you're going to do something and then you got trouble doing it. How do you approach that situation?
Another great question. I mean, you guys sure do ask good questions, but I think, you know, we will all have times where things don't go our way or we make mistakes. And one of the things I did fairly frequently, I probably more than I wanted to, is I just made some mistakes.
Yeah.
I did things wrong, you know, took a wrong turn with a client, had the client mad at me. And what I found, and I guess I sort of got into this accidentally, but I figured out that if you go to the client and you just keep taking a punch, is the way I put it. Like, you go back to the client and say, I know you're mad at me, but I've been thinking about this situation and I've come up with the following ideas. And sometimes, you know, you just keep coming, you just keep standing up. And if the client punches you again, fall back down and get back up and take it, because they're the client. And what I figured out is ultimately, if you do that enough, the client will eventually kind of go, you know, this person may not be perfect, but I haven't met anybody who is, but this person cares. And, you know, people will give you a lot of points if you care. I mean, if you just are trying and your heart's in it, most people will come around to that. And most people actually would rather have that than they would, you know, perfection, frankly. Not that they don't want both, but.
You're right on target again. I think we all make mistakes, and I've made some bad ones sometimes, but you just keep trying. Okay. They want to know, Abigail wants to know, what's a typical day look like for you? What time you get up? 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock? What do you do, buddy?
Well, my days are, I don't know, they're probably, I'm still pretty busy. I'm not doing exactly the same things I was doing, but you know, I sit on a bunch of boards. I've got a lot going on, frankly. And so I'm working pretty hard, by choice. So my day, I get up sometime between 5 and 6. I start just about every day with a workout. I'm a big believer in physical fitness. It's kind of a hobby. You know, I just like it. I like the way it makes me feel. And I think that to the extent that you're investing in yourself for the long haul, taking care of yourself makes more sense than not taking care of yourself. So I start the day that way. And I guess to not to get into too much detail, I start my days kind of slow. I get up early and I give myself, now there's some days I can't get away with it, but generally if I can get away with it, I give myself the first few hours of the day. I work out, I read the Wall Street Journal, I have breakfast, pet my dogs, you know, and I may do something that involves, you know, some thinking or some study. But I try to give myself, you know, 2 or 3 hours or so before the day just takes off for real, if that makes sense.
I think you're right there again. And I've heard many people in this, you have got to take care of yourself. You can't do a good job if you don't feel good, if you're sick, and you got to take care of your family. And sometimes that means you got to walk away and take a break. It's the only way to survive. Can you talk about the most challenging project you faced in your career?
Well, that would be hard for me because I would be thinking about it in terms of consulting assignment, something like that. I'll tell you one of the most, I don't know that I would call it unduly challenging or anything, but one of the things that was most interesting was probably 20 years ago, I lose track of time, but it's probably been 20 years ago that there's a big Australian company called Lend-Lease, and they came to the United States. Yep. And they bought a big building contractor called Bovis.
Yep.
And without getting into too many old war stories, I would just say that working with those Australians was one of the most interesting things I ever did. At least I found it interesting. Just they were very, you know, people have an image of Australians as kind of being like Crocodile Dundee or whatever, like laid back and, you know, all going surfing or whatever. But and I think some of that I think is maybe true, but these guys were very intense and they worked around the clock. They were flying all over the world. It was just an interesting experience, and I could go on, but it was maybe it was the international, coming to America kind of aspect of it that made it interesting.
Yeah. If you had the power to change anything, what would you like to change?
Well, would that be about the world, about myself?
I think it's about this business, but you can answer it any way you want, my friend.
Well, there's lots I probably should change about myself, according to my spouse, but notwithstanding that, I think about the business. If I could change anything about the business, I would like to see society in the United States assign more value to the built environment than I think that it typically does. And I could go off on a soapbox about that, but I think in the United States generally, and maybe it's because we're a young country compared to a lot of European countries or others, but we don't put the focus on our built environment the way other countries do, and we don't assign value to it. And I think that trickles down to making some of the businesses tougher than maybe they need to be.
Mm-hmm. All right, one last question here. What's the best way to get into a startup? In other words, how do you start up your little company or make it grow?
Well,
Starting your own.
Okay, so you're going to start your own company, which is a brave thing to do. If we assume that you are going to do it in the construction industry and you're going to start something like a construction business, the number one issue will be capital. And the reason the bonding business exists in the construction industry is that all the companies are undercapitalized relative to the volume that they take on. So the businesses that will survive and live to fight another day and therefore grow, and it's like a staircase, you got to keep climbing. So the businesses that are going to do that, they will always have cash, they will always have capital. You can't run out of cash. You can't let the capital get burned up. And a lot of people, what happens to people is they get in this business. I've seen this a million times. Building contractors, good example of it. They start building buildings. They get all this advance payment. Next thing you know, they've got millions of dollars running through their hands to pay for these buildings. And they, if they're not financially savvy, they start thinking that's their money. Well, all that is money that's running through, and it's not their money. And if they don't treat it right, there won't be any left when the projects are over with, and then they'll be broke. So without getting too long-winded, I would say the key to your own business is capital. You've got to figure out where to get it from. You've got to figure out how to preserve it. You got to figure out how to grow it. Other than that, you won't be in business, at least not very long.
All right. We need to kind of wrap it up. I've got Michael Rochelle asked us the question about, in your experience, what was the key to developing a good team? And he's our scholarship winner tonight. And I want to give you time, Hank, to anything you'd like to say before we shut it down here.
Well, I just would like to thank you, Cliff, for doing this, and Jane, and also I want to thank everybody that sent questions and participated. It's a genuine pleasure, genuine honor, and I hope some of the things I've said have been helpful. And thank you for having me.
Appreciate you taking the time. Go enjoy your dinner.
Yes, sir.